a brave slave who was under the torture of her owner, later made a great escape. Once she was free, she decided to devote her life to helping about 70 of her enslaved family and friends to freedom. Harriet Tubman took a stand against slavery and was one of the main conductors of the Underground Railroad. She became an iconic figure in history for the dangers she faced risking her life, leading slaves to freedom, spying for the Union during the Civil War, and fighting for women's rights. After the slaves were emancipated by the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, she encouraged others to take a stand for what they believed in.
Harriet Tubman was born into slavery in Maryland in about 1822. Her birth name was Arminta, but her nickname was Minty. At the age of 5, her family was taken away from her, and she was sold to her cruel master. Throughout her slave life, she was put through many beatings. One time, when she was at the store for her owner, the store owner threw an iron weight at a runaway slave, but accidentally hit Harriet, giving her a major injury to the head. People thought she had epilepsy, and she would always have massive headaches, would randomly fall asleep during everyday chores, and would have hallucinations of the future. Dreams that Harriet had was one of the major things that encouraged her to take a stand against slavery.
White slave owners, or non-abolitionists, believed God created blacks to be inferior to whites. In the 1830s, 2 million people were slaves in America. Slaves lived in cramped quarters, 4 families in a cabin meant for 2. They had to work from dawn to dusk 6 days a week. Many of them died of overwork, starvation, and dehydration, and never got a break until nighttime. As a slave, Harriet cared for her master's baby. In her later slave years, she carried heavy logs and learned to use an axe. These skills helped in 1849 when Harriet bravely escaped to freedom using the route from eastern Maryland to Delaware and north to Philadelphia.
There were many people who would do anything to get slaves to freedom. These people, called abolitionists, would give runaway slaves a place to stay, rest, get cleaned up, and eat. Along with Harriet, Frederick Douglass was a leading abolitionist and anti-slave campaigner. Harriet once proudly pointed out to Frederick Douglass she never lost a single passenger. She helped about 70 slaves get to the Promised Land. She even led some past the border into Canada.
As a conductor, Harriet Tubman led slaves from station to station on the Underground Railroad. These stations were the homes and businesses of abolitionists. Since the slaves were illiterate, conductors would write down the letters of a sign that would lead them to the next stop. Special lanterns hung outside the stations showed the slaves that it was a safe place to stop and get help.
Harriet used spiritual songs as another way of communicating where to go. Because Harriet has such a beautiful voice, the guards would think she was being joyful and happy, and they weren't suspicious. But songs like Go Down Moses and Bound for the Promised Land gave directions on where to get to freedom, and different tempos indicated if it was safe to come out of hiding or not.
Escapees on the Underground Railroad traveled by foot, on small boats, or in covered wagons. Some were even shipped in boxes by rail or sea. Harriet used similar routes each time, where she made connections which helped lead others to freedom.
It was important for runaways to travel quietly under the darkness of night. Their journey to freedom would take about 6 weeks or 800 miles, but struggles along the way would set runaways back. If a baby was on the trip, Harriet knew herbs that would keep them from crying.
She was able to go back and forth at great risk to herself during the Underground Railroad and bring people away. You know, how did she do that? She didn't have maps. She couldn't read. So she just used her great mind in order to remember the landscape, to understand what the landscape was telling her. She learned from her father how to navigate by the stars, and also there are skills that people had then that most people don't have today, and it's an ability to look like at a field of corn or a field of wheat and be able to know the direction of the wind and how important the flow of a river is and what direction the river is flowing.
It was important to stay hidden on their journey, so Harriet had many tricks up her sleeve.
She dressed as an old person. She carried those chickens once, and when she saw an old master, she let the chickens go, so he looked at the chickens squawking and not at her.
Sometimes, when slaves had to ride on boats, it would take a long time because they tried to avoid paddling. They believed paddling would make too much noise. They were not going to risk getting caught. Harriet once said that she would shoot a man before he tried to turn back because she wasn't going to risk hundreds of people's lives just because of one man.
Fugitive Slave Bill of 1850 was passed by the United States Congress on September 18th. It said that all escaped slaves were upon capture to be returned to their masters and that officials and citizens of free states had to cooperate with this law. The North wasn't safe for runaways anymore, but in Canada, slavery was abolished.
Harriet brought fugitive slaves from New York to St. Catharines in Ontario, Canada, a community that accepted fugitive slaves. Once they got to Canada, they were free. The abolitionists helped them with food, shelter, and protection while they were getting settled in their new environment.
Harriet used her abilities to help the Union Army during the Civil War. As a spy, she served as a guerrilla operative, leading successful raids behind enemy lines and establishing networks in different communities to supply Union forces with information concerning troop placements, supply lines, and fortifications. As a nurse, she introduced a variety of herbal and holistic remedies to ailing soldiers, often curing what could have been fatal infections and diseases. Harriet Tubman was also the only woman to lead a military operation during the Civil War. At the Combahee River Raid, she led 150 black soldiers to save Union ships and free 750 slaves.
There were many different ways that she affected the outcome of the Civil War, and it was more on a personal level for people that met her and knew her. So for the enslaved people that she helped liberate, for the soldiers that she helped comfort and to cure in the hospitals, that's really important because she saved lives, and that is an important outcome of the Civil War for them. She got really important intelligence from her spies and from her own spying that helped the Union Army do their raids.
After the war, Harriet received an $8 a month pension as the widow of a Civil War veteran. She had to petition Congress to get her own pension. It wasn't until 1899 that Congress increased her pension to $25 a month for her service in the Union. She was the first African American woman to receive a military pension. Tubman was a strong supporter of the women's suffrage movement. She toured and gave speeches about her years as Moses and the impact she had on the hundreds born under the bondage of slavery. She attended every women's suffrage meeting in the late 1850s. She challenged inferior political, economic, and social roles, incorporating racial and gender equality. Her life revolves around being active and standing up for what she believed in.
When she gave speeches, she reminded white women in particular that the vote belonged to black women as well, because some white women during that time period didn't want to give the vote to black women. They just wanted it for white women.
In Harriet's later years, she dedicated her life to helping the elderly, disabled, and the poor. She purchased 25 acres in Auburn, New York, and created the Harriet Tubman Home for Aged and Indigent Colored People, which formally opened in 1908. The home was deeded to the AME Zion Church when she was too old to take care of the house herself. Today, it is the Harriet Tubman Historical National Park.
Harriet had a big impact on many people who stood up for what they believed in.
Some of those abolitionists wrote in their letters how much they admired her, and they would quote her because she would say things they thought were really smart, and they decided to agree with her and follow her. And they admired her so much. They really, really did. They were deeply moved by her.
Frederick Douglass was inspired by Harriet, and in one of his letters he wrote, "I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have. Much that you have done would seem improbable to those who don't know you as I know you. It is to me a great pleasure and a great privilege to bear testimony to your character and your works, and to say to those to whom you may come that I regard you in every way truthful and trustworthy." Douglass was truly touched by Harriet's actions and her stand against slavery, which served as an inspiration to him and many other abolitionists and civil rights leaders.
In 2020, Harriet Tubman is going to be on the $20 bill, and she already has 2 national parks in her name. She was a strong woman, often doing the work of men.
She was committed to her dream of freedom, equal rights, and helping people in need, devoting her entire life to these ideals. She was brave, strong, and courageous.